PowerPoint? All right, so this is just something I put together for the cohorts about things that I've run into, things that I see, ideally to try to help. So hopefully it does. If it doesn't, I apologize. So just some things to know about this. So that, like I said, this is just a summary of my experiences, the things I've commonly run into. And it's definitely thought of from an SEO first perspective and less from me wearing my developer hat. I will tell you, it's not going to help you learn JavaScript development. It's not a comparison of the different frameworks. It certainly does not cover all possible topics, because that would be pretty much impossible. And then there could also be mistakes. So these are just things that worked for me, but it doesn't mean they're perfect. And also things update. So if we refer to this in a year, things might be different. So just so you know. As far as the frameworks we're going to take a look at, we're going to look at, I'm calling it foundational JavaScript. It's usually just, just JavaScript sites, or in development, we typically call that vanilla JavaScript. React, and then they have a tool called Gatsby, and then we're going to talk about Angular and Vue. So React, Angular, and Vue are the three most popular JavaScript-based frameworks, but there are dozens, if not hundreds more. But I wanted to cover these three since these are the ones that we'll typically be running into as SEOs who just come across JavaScript sites. When I'm going through and find out, you know, as far as my process goes with these things, the first thing I always have to do is identify the stack. So I have to identify which technology is being used. I use a Chrome extension called Wathalizer. Highly recommend it. And we can take a look at it after the slides of just what it looks like. Also, anytime you need it, it can make you sound really impressive, because clients will be like, how in the world did you know what my website's built on? And you just look like a wizard. So let's all be wizards. Then I'll do site crawls. So I either use Screaming Frog or hrefs with the JS rendering, and look for any kind of errors that may come up. And then also really important is investigating how things are being rendered. What does Google Search Console have as far as the content for that page? Because there's definitely times where maybe your content's being crawled but not indexed. Maybe some of it's being crawled. You know, really being able to identify where those nuances are is pretty critical to diagnosing your issues. So to dive into our first problem, so are you seeing that only a portion of your page or content is getting crawled and indexed? So maybe this is like you've gone into Google Search Console and you see that the page URL is there, but it's only getting about 40% of the content. Chances are there's a JavaScript error. And then also, so you guys know, I have put these little like pills at the top so that I can tell you which framework it applies to. But when you look in Inspect, and that should be Google Chrome Inspect, basically look in the Chrome Dev Tools, and then if you see something like this, it could be causing a JavaScript error that is making the rest of the page unparsable. As a rule, JavaScript is very unforgiving when it comes to languages. Also, its error handling essentially sucks. Error handling is basically the message that's delivered to you as far as telling you what's wrong. So really the only solution you have at this point is to ask your developer, hey, what does this mean? Now, I will say, like this one, if you see an uncut syntax error, so syntax errors are actually errors, but if you see something at the top of the console, because you'll usually see a few more messages here, if it's at the very top, 9 times out of 10 in my experience, it's just an alert and not really an error. So just know that your dev might say that, and it's probably pretty founded. Now, of course, developers are inherently lazy. That's why we code things to do the work for us. So if you have any questions about that, of course, pose the question in Women in Tech SEO. I'm sure you'll get some answers. And then also just a note, as someone who is a developer, just remember when you're framing this and how you communicate, like, hey, what does this mean? It can make someone go immediately on the offensive and not want to help you. So you know, as much as we're always having to work with our clients, our internal teams to really comfort them and make sure they know that, A, we are the experts and they come to us to have those answers, we need to have the mindset with our developers, they are the experts. They just may not know how to implement it according to the way we want to, which is why we have to document it. So that's the first problem. Next problem, maybe you have entire pages or sections of your site that aren't being crawled. Does anybody actually know what not the gumdrop buttons comes from? I gotta deliver this to an American audience. It's from Shrek. I have a lot of like pop culture references in here that I shouldn't have put in, but they're there. So first off, you could have a bad linking approach. So kind of the same that we would have with any website. If you don't have links to the content, then it makes it really impossible for Google to find it. And then of course, we've talked about this quite a bit at length as far as you have to use anchor tags and these other methods of like a router link or a span or on click, those are not functional. Unfortunately, developers, from everything I can tell, that go to school or boot camp, they don't really get or set a standard on how links should be used. So to a developer, all of these methods are totally valid. So our job as SEOs is we need to provide documentation. And then I also have a link to Google's documentation, and I straight up pulled this screenshot from there. So that makes it a lot easier. Developers love documentation. If they don't, that's pretty weird. It could also be a single page app or an SPA. Is everybody familiar with what an SPA is? Yes, okay. So basically with single page apps, React, Angular, Vue, they all make SPAs at their base level. And of course that can be really cool because you just kind of skip through content. There's no page load events that need to fire. But that does also mean that crawlers aren't seeing the changing content. So that can be an issue. Now, just a side note, if you ever have an app where you actually don't need it to be crawled, but you do want to see it in Google Analytics, you can actually circumvent that problem by feeding history change events. So that's not going to help your SEO, but just a little tracking information, since Google Analytics and data is my other love. So as far as when you have an SPA, your options for fixing that, there's some rendering options, and then there's also router plugins or extensions for each of the frameworks. And so we're going to talk a little bit about all of those. Any questions so far? Nope. Excellent. All right, so for the rendering options, so I put together this chart. These are just my recommended or what I've found that works really well or consistently come across. So the idea with this is that depending on the framework and depending what style of rendering you'd like to utilize, this would be the type of tool that you could recommend to the development team. So pre-rendering, so that's where it happens. We're all familiar with that. So prerender.io. There's also a plugin for React called React Snap. We're going to talk quite a bit about Angular Universal. And then there's also some pre-rendering Webpacks and CLI for Vue. So all of those, except for the prerender.io, are actually plugins. So, or essentially other libraries that would get added to the app that's already there. And just so you know, anytime you're using React, Angular, or Vue, even if it's a website, it's actually always called an app. There's straight up an app tag that houses everything. Then you have server side. So of course, that's where all of the calculations are being done on the server and not in the client browser. So React does this by using Node or a plugin library called Next.js. Angular Universal. So to talk about that a little bit, Angular is actually the framework that Google uses. So they spend a lot of resources and development on making improvements to Angular. So there is another kind of sub-library of Angular called Angular Universal. And this puts together both pre-rendering options, server side, and really handles a lot of the what's considered best practices for SEO. It also has quite a bit of other uses in other kinds of functions, more than just SEO. So it's pretty common that if you have Angular, it's probably going to also include Angular Universal. However, I will say Angular Universal is more useful in Angular version 2 versus version 1. And we can talk a little bit. Basically, if you see someone saying Angular JS, that's version 1. If they're just saying Angular, that's version 2. Why it's that way, I have no idea. But just so you know when you're talking about it. And then Vue has a library called Next.js that can be used for the server side. Now, with server side, they almost all require some special server setup. Like for the React, you actually have to have Node running on the server. It could sound really scary, but actually pretty much every major hosting service that can do apps like this can also support Node. The difference is if you're ever using Azure or a Microsoft-based server, they have their own unique things going on. It can still be done, but I would just recommend that you probably need to at least get a consultant to help set up that server correctly. And at that point, that's probably out of SEO's purview and it's on engineering. Or if you see it's on Windows, maybe just run far away if you're an agency, because IIS is the bane of my existence. Next, we have dynamic. So of course, that's one of the ones that we studied from, that's referenced in Google's documentation. So there are a couple tools that do that. And remember that dynamic is where basically when the query is made to pull the page data or get, the server looks at who is asking for this data and will either give the response of the live JavaScript client-enabled version, or they will serve kind of the static version. And that will get served to crawlers and bots. So that's what dynamic is. There are a couple different tools. So prerender.io again. Rendertron is also a very popular tool used for it. I personally have not used it. I've used prerender.io, but those are kind of the two biggest ones that are accepted. Next, you have isomorphic. So isomorphic is probably one of the things that I absolutely love. So isomorphic is a little bit different than dynamic in the fact that it will always serve the static one first. And then if it sees that the client or who is accessing this information has browser, is capable of doing JavaScript on the client side, it will then serve the JavaScript enabled and interactive one. There is no difference to the user. They don't see the change at all. But I really like it because the response time's a little bit faster because there isn't that amount of logic that needs to happen when the request is made, like there is in dynamic. Because remember, in dynamic, the request is made, the server then says, oh, who is this? And then determines what to send. In isomorphic, the same thing is always sent, and then it does the query, and then it'll change content if it needs to. Isomorphic is something that's becoming very popular among JavaScript frameworks. React already has it with this plugin called Isomorphic Render. Angular Universal for version 2 already does it. Vue, however, does not support any isomorphic rendering options that I've heard of so far. In order to do it, you have to use server-side rendering, and then at that point, you're actually introducing new technologies to make it happen. Lastly, we have static site generators. So this is where, if you're familiar with how WordPress works, you basically have your template, the PHP goes to the server and pulls the applicable content that should be rendered within that template. So essentially what a static site generator does is it does the same exact thing, but it's going to go ahead and take all of that HTML, create the raw HTML files for you, and then actually at the end of the day, you're serving these HTML files. Gatsby is one of the most popular ones for React, but there's also Hugo and Jekyll, which are making big waves. For Angular, Scully is pretty much the only one that can be found, and it's not very popular. So using static site generation is not very popular for Angular users. And then for Vue, you've got VuePress and GridSum. So those are some of the biggest ones, but definitely when it comes to static site generators, you're going to see React a lot more than anything else. There's a lot of information. Questions?
Yes. Could you say a little bit more about the dynamic rendering in terms of it used to be really recommended by Google, and now I sort of hear that it's kind of not recommended anymore. It's considered like, well, we used to recommend that, but now I don't know. I hear names like hydration and all kinds of stuff I don't understand are somehow better than the dynamic rendering. Could you do you have any opinion you could offer there, or like what's the development going? In what direction is this going?
Sure. So everything that's within Google's documentation, because I was making sure I had all my ducks in a row while making this presentation. Everything in Google's documentation is still supporting dynamic. However, the development community is definitely supporting more isomorphic, which uses that hydration layer. So that's where you're going to hear a lot about it, is usually having to do with isomorphic. There's a couple other rendering versions that use hydration, but they are much less popular than isomorphic because it is becoming something that's so almost natural to React and Angular. Like it's becoming almost part of like the default set that anybody would use. So the other reason for that is just, you know, to me, and this is just a personal opinion, the reason I like isomorphic is because it looks at the user at the time as they're engaging, but the response has already been made. So they're already seeing something, whether it's a user, like an actual person or a crawler. Whereas dynamic, I personally really worry about, you know, that request and then the calculation of what to serve. Like we already know that Google has crawlers and other search engines that don't actually identify themselves as Google, right? So what are they getting served is kind of hard to tell. The isomorphic is identifying whether a user has the capability of client-side rendering versus just who is making this request. So to me, isomorphic's a little bit more reliable. Dynamic as well with edge computing. So basically right before the the response leaves the server, edge computing is becoming bigger, but that's also becoming a little bit of a security risk, meaning somebody could potentially screw with that response. So it's just a bit of a security gap that has to be taken into consideration when using dynamic. Now, pre-render and RenderTron, they already have those security measures in place, so you don't really have to worry about that. It's just if you were doing it kind of all by hand or custom on your own servers, those are considerations that you'd have to think about. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks. And really short, if a team is using Vue and they're already familiar with Nuxt, can you think, would there be any reason to change to dynamic, or should they stay with Nuxt?
So with server side, the biggest thing is the configuration. So if it's already running, I would keep it that way. Because also on server side, everybody's getting the same kind of content.
Yeah, I like that too.
Yeah. So yeah, it's just the setup is where it gets it's probably the most difficult to set up, but if you have it, there's no reason to change it, in my opinion.
Thanks.
Any other questions about all the rendering options? Okay, cool beans. Yeah. So the other option you have for rendering is also router, and it's not, I should say this isn't really an either or, both should be used. So routers are essentially how these single page apps kind of guide what content should be loaded where. So there are some router plugins that then provide actual URIs or URLs so that there are unique locations, like I say, URIs where that content can be accessed. So React uses React Router v4. Pretty much any React project that you have, if they don't have that, what are they doing? I don't know. It also can be used with Redux, which is a state management. We're not really going to get into that, but just know Redux is a pretty popular thing that you may run into. And you can tell if it's there by using Wapalizer. Angular, as I said, Angular universal. So this actually provides that same kind of routing and creating URL functionality. And then in Vue, if it's a newer version of Vue, then you can use history mode instead of hash mode. And the way to know whether it's using hash or history mode is first you look at the Vue version, and if it's greater than 2, then it has this configuration option. But basically, when you're changing the content that you're looking at, if you're seeing that there is a parameter changing, or basically you just have the pound sign with the content, that's what changes, then it's in hash mode. If you, from that point, it just needs to be put in history mode, and then URLs will automatically be generated. If it's an older version, so any of the one dots, you can use a plugin called Vue Router. So one of the really nice things about Wapalizer is it will tell you which version of Vue or Angular is being used. Another reason why sections of your site may not be getting crawled is because there's no XML sitemap. So thankfully, for all of these, whether it's React, Angular, Vue, or Gatsby, there are plugins to produce XML sitemaps. Now, sometimes there may be a lot of customization that needs to be done. At that point, you're just going to have to document and work with your developers. So documentation all the time. And then these are the sitemap plugins that I recommend and have used, so I can vouch for their functionality. Also, we're going to talk a little bit later about some of the problems, but basically whenever a query is run to pull the proper content, you do want the query to filter the content and not the module that's been rendering how it looks. We're going to talk a lot more about that, so if it doesn't make sense yet, it's okay. So those are the 3 things that could be happening when it comes to sections of your site aren't being crawled and indexed. Remember, that was you're not linking properly, you have rendering or router issues, or there's no XML sitemap. Woo, let's move on. Okay, so content is being crawled, your images show up on the page when you're looking at it, but your images aren't being indexed. All right, so the first thing could be, and this would be true for any site, not just JavaScript sites, but if your images are being served in the CSS instead of HTML, they're not going to get indexed. So also note that that can be a great thing to have in your tool belt on the other side, because maybe you just have these backgrounds or these button gradients that you don't want to be indexed. Put them in the CSS. You don't have to worry about that. There's also documentation. So again, I pulled this from Google's documentation. There's a link to it so that you can see how all of that works. Yeah, that one's pretty easy. So the next one, all right, but your images aren't showing at all. So remember, the last one was if you're seeing your images show up when you're looking in GSC Inspect. This is your images aren't showing in the rendering at all. So first off, you need to make sure that you are not blocking crawlers to your asset folders. This is something that's pretty common with JavaScript frameworks, is that there will inherently be some measures taken to reduce the number of requests on assets so that you don't get pinged by nonsensical traffic or people trying to overload your server. So you just have to make sure that your folder where the assets are stored has the permissions to allow crawlers. The way you can do this is test it in GSC. It will probably tell you whether it can grab it or not. You're going to have to check your robots.txt and your redirect rule. So are you redirecting that request to the assets folder? That is pretty common. You could, and that would be something where you're redirecting really just other agents than your own, because essentially if your code is making a request, then it's allowed because it's coming from internal. Whether if it's coming from external, then it won't let render. So that's pretty common. You also have to look at your security protocols and headers. that one gets pretty advanced, and even some of it is out of my own purview. I Google a lot with that. So don't be afraid to Google. Questions on that?
I do have a question. Although it's not really related to necessarily only JavaScript rich websites, but I have been seeing an issue in Search Console when you check a website. But actually, we have this problem. So on each first hit, it tells me that it cannot access any resource. So anything on our CDN, for example. So it cannot access, not everything is on our CDN, but it cannot access CSS files, JavaScript files, you know. And then when I check it again, everything's there with Search Console. So, and then when I check again, it doesn't show again. So, you know, so on each first and third and fifth hit, I get this problem. Whereas it doesn't seem that Google has any problem with our sites at all. I don't have that issue in crawling at all. Because I was at first suspecting we have a problem with caching. We use Cloudflare, but that it doesn't seem to be a problem. So I was wondering if you had seen this in the past happening anywhere, because it's really annoying, because that way I never know, how much can I rely on what Search Console says about our pages, and why is that happening?
Yeah. So I have not seen that. My first thought definitely went to caching as well. I also would wonder about security headers.
Yeah, I checked them, but they look okay. So it's really weird.
I also wonder if it's in the server configuration and whitelisting. That might be something to check out as well.
Okay, yeah.
Because I've definitely seen security measures where it's like, it doesn't take the first time it recognizes an IP address, but it'll take it the second time to try to help avoid DDoS attacks.
Yes, we do have measures like that in place, although this problem existed even before we had those measures.
Well,
so that is weird.
Cloudflare has some of that too.
Yes, exactly. And before we started using that, we already had that issue. So it did not increase as an issue after we started using protection against DDoS attacks. And the weird thing is, so at first I thought it's a caching problem because on the first hit, you don't get the resources and you get them on the second hit. But then on the third hit, you don't get the resources again. So that's just utterly weird.
Okay.
Because by then it should have been cached. So I feel like just.
Yeah, so it definitely sounds like a server response issue. So let me ask my husband about that. He used to be a server infrastructure engineer. So let me see if he has any ideas why that could happen.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Having him as a husband is awesome. It's like cheating at life.
I imagine.
Yeah, and now he's a full stack developer, so just all of the things. He answers all of my questions. But great question. If you do find an answer, let us know. And then, like I said, I'll update after I talk to Arthur, and we can try to continue diagnosing from there, because that's very interesting.
I will. I have been trying to, because we have had this issue for a year maybe, and I've been trying to get our developers on it, but it was always like prioritized away. Because like
actively broken to them. So
exactly, and because they say it seems that this is a Search Console issue, and someone claimed that it's also an issue that someone else outside of our company has seen as well. But I have never heard of anyone having had that problem.
Yeah, so that's a new one for me. Yeah,
I'm still suspicious, so I still think it deserves looking into.
I think so, because it also means that, you know, how much, if they're not getting a response the first time, it could mean that you're not getting, that content isn't getting crawled as often as it warrants being crawled.
Yeah.
Exactly. So for sure it could be effective. I would think it's definitely making an effect on the budget and efficiency of that budget. So
yeah. Thank you.
Awesome. Oh, let's see. We can do this. Okay. So metadata for pages are missing. So page titles, meta descriptions, robots, directives, canonicals, all of that, which really is probably about 70% of the issues I run into with JavaScript frameworks. It just means somebody didn't put in the plugin and it's not configured properly. So all of the JavaScript frameworks have these plugins for supporting SEO. Unfortunately, this is also one of those cases where really you just have to go to your developer. There's nothing that really you can do as an SEO because obviously something is wrong with the code. So the first thing to do is confirm that the SEO plugin is there, and I have a list of the recommended ones in a second. And then creating documentation for how each tag should be rendered. What type of, for each type of content that exists on your site. So think of all the different post types, whether it's a page or a blog post or a resource or like a team person, whatever, all of that. You're gonna have to create all of that. And then the most important part is also mapping to wherever that content is housed. So your CMS, what field in the CMS should match to that. It's really painful to write the first time. I know, I've done it. But I will also say, once you write it the first time, you never have to write it again. You just have to make changes as you work on different frameworks or different types of websites, different companies to map to obviously their types of content. But you'll never have to write again, like, this is what a title tag should look like. This is where it should go. It should be appended with the brand, you know, all of that good stuff. You never have to do it again. And then that is also something that I say, regardless of where you are, always take it with you. That is your IP. Yeah, just keep a copy in your own personal Dropbox or Google Drive, whatever you have. Take it with you. Unless, of course, you have contracts that explicitly say you can't, then don't, because I don't want anybody to get legally in trouble. But it's all in your brain. So according to IP law, if you could write it again, you could take it with you. Just FYI. So if there is no plugin, the plugins that are recommended for each of these, Helmet for React. I'm going to be perfectly honest with the functionality that Helmet brings to React apps. If your developer does not have Helmet installed, and I were the engineering manager, I would fire that developer. Helmet is too useful. It should always be used. That might be very close-minded, and maybe there are things I don't understand, but from everything I know, everybody uses it. You're kind of missing the boat if you don't. Angular, again, it's that Angular universal, so you're pretty much always going to have that in every Angular app as well. And then in Vue, there are a few different ones out there. The most used and most recommended one, and the one I've used, is Vue Meta. Now, when talking about these, this is also a great time to start talking to your developers about how to implement structured data that would actually scale with the post types. So I haven't done that with Angular and Vue, but I've done that quite a few times with React and also with Gatsby, as far as being able to just kind of tag on that functionality within Helmet. It's really easy. There are a ton of articles out there on how to do it that you can send to your developers, and it just makes life that much easier. It renders the JSON in the page so that you can get that structured data yumminess just already baked in. All right, now we're going to go into some of the more framework specific, and then just a complete disclaimer. When it comes to coding my own projects, I am a React developer. I can muddle my way through Angular and Vue, but React is definitely my chosen stack. So I have a lot more experience in those. So as we go into the specifics, you'll see it's basically just React and Gatsby. That's because that's what I use. It's what I recommend when clients are wanting to build things. So that's what I like. So the React site is using a default 404 page. So you're seeing that horribly ugly page. We've all seen it, where it's the red text and a gray box at the top. There's a missing config file in your React app. If you're using the React Router 4, which of course we recommended earlier, to use that for creating the URIs and URLs that you want, so that there are specific or very depicted locations for content. You just need to check with your developers that they've created a Route.js and Server.js. file, make sure that there is code in there. And for the design of a 404 page, that's where it needs to go. It's really considered not best practice to go ahead and try to use like a page template. You should actually have like a separate file for the 404 page. Also, I found that this works extremely well. Whenever developers are not giving me an answer on this one, I then ask for read-only access to the Git repo so I can just look at it myself. And then all of a sudden I magically have an answer. So just know developers tend to not want anybody looking at stuff. Why, I'm not really sure, but there you go. So like I said, those are the two files that you need to make sure those exist, and then also that the design for the 4.0 page lives there. Oh, and I should say that can apply to both React and Gatsby. So it's not just React, it would also happen in the Gatsby site. So with Gatsby, if you do a WAPalizer and find that you're working with a Gatsby site, pretty much count on there's going to be an issue with canonical tags. Probably every Gatsby site that I've come into after the fact, they were never working right. So chances are it's because the developers were like, oh, we need to have canonical tags. And they used this canonical plugin called Gatsby plugin canonical URLs. Everything sounds great, right? Except not, because that plugin actually builds a canonical on every content piece, and it's always self-referencing. So if you actually need canonical tags for the uses of it, of preventing duplicate content, then it actually needs to be hard-coded. This is another great extension for adding to Helmet. There's an article written by another developer who wrote up how to do this far more eloquently than I ever could. So that's linked here. So it's super easy to implement. It is something that should be done custom when it comes to React because that plugin is just not reliable. And then just make sure that whatever CMS you're using with it, that you actually have a place where you can declare that canonical. Also, I would recommend, unless you like doing really mundane, monotonous things, place a fallback for the developers that it would just use the default self-referencing if nothing is there. So if the value is null or empty in the CMS, it would just reference to itself. So it's just an idea. So another Gatsby thing, I've got orphaned pages that shouldn't be live, what's happening. So there's a few different things. First off, Gatsby. So if you remember static site generators, what they do is they actually go through and render the site as if someone were going through it, making all those requests. So while it's doing that, while it's going through the build process, it creates a build folder. Now there is a build folder for every time it's done. So what you actually see is there's a build folder, and then there's all these subfolders with like 20 character strings, which note which build it was. Once a build is finished, then that content is taken over to the public HTML file, which is essentially your website that's accessible by normal users. So if the build gets interrupted, there will still, that porting doesn't happen. So there are pages in this build file that never went live, except that folder is still accessible. So you may end up with pages that are like maybe drafts or copies of pages that are actually live on your site, but they're orphaned because there's going to be no links directly to that build version of it. Those would just stay there and still be crawlable. Less than ideal. So if it got interrupted, you're going to have to run the build again. And then you also need to go ahead and have the build folders kind of cleaned up every now and then, like a routine task. I actually set all of mine up to do a cron job on the server to clean those up every day. So that's something that should be relatively easy for your developers to implement. There could also be, maybe the site gets built And so you have all the files in the build folder, they get placed over to the public HTML. Maybe you're saying that draft content or content that shouldn't be posted yet, shouldn't be published, is live. So an example of this would be like, maybe you have a blog post that's in draft. And so when you look at the blog role or the blog index, that post doesn't show up there, but you can still actually access that blog detail page. Well, probably what's happening here, and I referenced this earlier, is that upon the build, everything's getting built and only some of the content is moving over to the public HTML. So your developer may have built some rules between the build folder and the public HTML port that some of the content shouldn't be moved over to public HTML. So that's why you could have these in draft posts that are rendering, the build process actually made them, but they don't actually get posted as live. So what's happening there is your developer could add the Gatsby plugin exclude. And essentially what that does is that moves it to, instead of building it and then not moving it over to the port, Gatsby is just never going to build it. So that's much more important. The Gatsby plugin exclude, you can set up all kinds of rules. So is it based on status? Is it based on URL? Yeah, just lots of different qualifications that you can have of why content shouldn't be built. So that plugin makes it really easy and prevents kind of all those random pages just showing up that you will pull your hair out until you figure out what's wrong. And I know that one from personal experience with my own website. So I think, oh no, we got one more. Okay, so the sources pages folder. So in every Gatsby project, there is a source and pages folder. That is just natural to the folder structure when a Gatsby app is created. So if the project hasn't gone through cleanup or the developers haven't refactored the code to make sure it's as elegant as possible, that folder could still end up existing, which means pages that are in it are still rendering. So you just want to make sure that that's been cleaned up. Again, if they're not really giving you a response, just ask if you can have read access to the repo so you can go diagnose yourself. And then all of a sudden you'll get really helpful answers. So anything that's in there, you probably just want it to be deleted. So that's some Gatsby specific fun. If anybody ever wants to talk about Gatsby, I love it. I think it's awesome. I think they're an awesome company. Highly recommend. All right, last thing could be it's happening on the query. So Gatsby uses a query language called GraphQL. You've heard of query languages before. The most popular one is SQL or SQL. So GraphQL is a new one. And basically, this is how the data is pulled from the CMS and populated into the static HTML files. Oftentimes, developers like to build their query to pull everything. But then when it comes to the module that's actually rendering the content, they'll put the filters there. The solution is that you should actually be putting the filter on the query itself and not on the rendering module. And not when it's mounted. So that is a big one. And there's also a lot of resources. So if you're ever in this situation, you're getting a lot of pushback from your developers. I have a library of resources available saying that doing it at the query level is best practice. Mostly because you reduce the server response. And so anybody who's head of engineering that hears less stress on your server is pretty much always going to say yes, because that's always a win. So those are the major questions and problems that I found. This has my tool set, what I use. So of course, Wapalizer that we talked about quite a bit. There's also a plugin called extension for Chrome called HTTP headers, which actually shows you all of the requests and responses and their codes. And then if you noticed consistently, the solutions for these problems is that you have to create documentation and work with your developers. So I linked this, that is the Google SEO Developer Guidelines. It's their own documentation. Use it as much as you want. There's no need to rework the work that they've already done. And then here I have some sample sites. for each of the frameworks, just in case you ever want to see it. So let's, for the last 2 minutes, I'll show you guys, let's see, just like using Wapalizer. Everybody good with that? Cool. Sure. There we go. Okay, so let me look in here for my, okay, so like everybody's favorite topic right now. Right. So if I pull this on Wapalizer, this is what it looks like. You can see it's Gatsby. It's using React for the JavaScript library. It's got another JavaScript framework called Emotion. So you can kind of just already see everything that's in there. Let's see, what's another fun one? Airbnb uses React.
Interesting. It looks like it looks different from when I use Wapalizer, but you're on a Mac, right?
I am.
Okay, because what I see is quite different. Like they have a specific area for checking for HTML issues as well, HTML5 issues as well, and accessibility, and it's quite interesting.
Dude, that sounds awesome.
It is awesome. It is even better, I would say.
Wow, I feel jacked right now. Yes, you can see there's React. They think there might be Ruby on Rails on the back end, can confirm. Which Ruby on Rails, just so everybody knows, is a back end language. You can do some front end, but you wouldn't normally. But I imagine that all of this, pulling the inventory of available Airbnbs, that's all using Ruby. Oh, so do you guys remember when I said that Google uses Angular and actually like helped create Angular? So really funny to me that their Google Careers actually uses Vue. So with it being like a, which React was something that Facebook developed. Angular was developed by Google and their parties. So it really cracks me up whenever I find Google properties that are using React or Vue instead of Angular, because I'm like, all right, who pissed this person off, right? Now I also imagine it usually comes from acquisitions for them. So maybe they acquired the technology that they use for their careers and just haven't changed it yet, but I get a nice little chuckle out of that. So it's like, if you're not using your own product, why should I? I'm just all right, so we are at time, but any other questions from that presentation? Also feedback if you thought it was horrible and a waste of your life. I will make it accessible to everybody in the Women in Tech SEO as well as this recording. So yeah, any questions or comments?